Hi everyone, this is Jennifer Hancock. I'm the author of a book called The Bully Vaccine and founder of Humanist Learning Systems. This program is a program for teachers on how to help kids stop bullies. I originally created this for teachers at the Sri Ram schools in Delhi. A couple of years ago, decided to record it and make it available to everyone in the hopes that, more teachers learn how to actually make bullying stop. We can be more effective at helping kids, and there's a lot of good that can come from that. Now, part of the reason I'm doing this is a lot of the information that's given out, it's good, like Ulvaeus is very good, but it's actually incomplete. I come from a background, behavioral psychology. I was an animal trainer. I actually know how to make unwanted behavior start. We have 7+ decades of research on how to make unwanted behavior stop. And that's what I'm going to be teaching you as it relates to helping kids stop bullying. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go through what the science says about, how kids learn to bully and what exactly the protocol is from a behavioral standpoint to make bullying stop. I'm going to make this available in a couple of different places. If you want a certificate of completion for this for continuing education purposes, you're going to need to take it at my website, Humanist Learning, but it'll be free there as well. I'm also going to, if you're at the website, at my website, you can download a couple of the materials that I'm going to talk about in this program. So again, how can teachers help kids stop bullying? Let's first talk about what makes a bully tick. Bullies bully because it works. Right? From a behavioral standpoint, any behavior you see has at some point been rewarded, which is why it's done. So that's kind of the important thing to understand. Bullying is often rewarded inadvertently. No one rewards a bully intentionally, but we do it inadvertently. Why do kids bully? Well, it depends, right? There's basically 3 types of bullying. Sometimes bullies have their own problem, and they're bullying what we call maladaptively, meaning they're doing it because something is wrong, and they're kids, so they don't really have the language or the social skills or the interpersonal skills to deal with those problems, so they're acting out. That is what we would call maladaptive bullying. Some kids do this strategically to gain advantage, right? They've learned at some point that being aggressive helps them get what they want with their peers, and so they've learned to be more aggressive. And some kids might actually have a mental health problem. Psychopathy, sociopathy, narcissism, things like that can result in unwanted behavior, but it helps to think of bullying in 3 different categories. Adaptive bullying, meaning the kid has learned to do it because it works. Maladaptive, because the bullies get some sort of problems that they don't know how to deal with. And mental health related bullying, where the child's not necessarily in control of their behavior. What I want you to get out of this is, don't assume you know what a child is dealing with. Don't assume a child who is bullying adaptively because they're a bad kid or that they have bad parents. That's rarely the case. So don't assume you know what a child is dealing with. Treat them with compassion, even if they're behaving badly, and especially if they're behaving badly. Don't assume you know what they're dealing with. Approach them with compassion. Because that'll help you come up with a strategy that will actually work and not compound the problems. So if you've got a bully who's doing it strategically, this will work for them as well. And I'm going to go into the science of how exactly to make it stop, and so you'll understand. But if they have problems at home, treating them as if they themselves are a problem is just going to make the problem worse. It's not going to help fix it. So feel compassion for kids that are behaving inappropriately. That doesn't mean you allow them to behave inappropriately, but it does impact how you approach them to deal with it. And this is really very important. And a lot of times we don't want to feel compassion for kids who are acting out, but that really is the right way to approach things. The hardest part of this really is compassion. Whenever I give talks on how to stop bullying to people, people are, oh, you just hit them and then they'll stop. okay, if you get to a point where bullying has resulted in physical violence, you failed to fix it earlier on. It would be more ideal if we fix the problem so it doesn't get to the point where we have violence. So that's what we should be shooting for. This is a frame of mind, right? When you're acting with compassion, it's how you're thinking about the problem, how you're thinking about the individuals who are experiencing the problem, both the bully and the victims and the bystanders. It's a frame of mind that helps you think more clearly and realistically about what might be going on. Instead of treating the problem child as a problem child, you treat them as a full human being with dignity that might have a problem. And that's always going to yield better results. The next thing that compassion does, and this is something you should be encouraging kids who are victims of bullying do, is it inoculates the victim against the bullying. If the victim thinks, oh, I'm being attacked, and they're focused on their own pain and their own trauma from what's going on, they're being traumatized for real. If you can encourage them to think about the bully as someone who has a problem that needs help, that itself actually inoculates the child who's being targeted from feeling hurt by what's going on, because it changes the whole frame of mind about what it is they're experiencing. They are not being targeted because of something that they did or something that is wrong with them. They are being targeted because this other kid is behaving inappropriately. The problem is the inappropriate behavior, not them. And as soon as you can focus on this behavior is inappropriate, it shouldn't be happening, but it is happening, which means there's something wrong going on, it helps inoculate the targets of bullying from feeling the worst effects of it. They're still going to be targeted, and we're going to talk about how to make that stop. But this frame of mind, this compassion, really does help victims and the people tasked, like the teachers tasked with fixing this problem, to be in the right frame of mind so that they're not hurt and that they can actually address the problem in a way that will work and not cause additional harm. I really like this quote: forgiveness is not something we do for other people, we do it for ourselves to get well and move on. A lot of times people think, oh, if I give compassion to this person, I'm saying that what they're doing is okay. That's not what compassion is. Forgiveness does not make what is happening okay. It just means that I'm not going to wait for the other person who is currently not treating me with dignity. I'm not going to wait for them to treat me with dignity before I treat myself with dignity. I'm going to claim my dignity for myself, and I do that by forgiving them and feeling compassion for them. And that frees me from needing their validation. I no longer need their validation. I no longer expect their validation because I'm not necessarily thinking they're in a place where they're capable of it. Whatever space a bully is in that's causing them to behave this way, they're clearly not in a space that they can treat other people with dignity. And that's their problem. It's not my problem. I don't need their validation to know that I have dignity and I'm a good person. I'm not waiting for them to do that. My life is not put on hold while this other person convinces me that I need their approval. I don't need their approval. And this is what compassion does. This is what forgiveness does. It's something we do for ourselves to put ourselves in the right frame of mind so that we are not harmed by what this person is doing. And again, this assumes what's going on is verbal and not physical. Obviously, it's physical. We are being physically hurt, and other types of intervention are going to be needed. And we're going to talk about that as we go forward. But compassion as a mindset is really critical to what we're going to do. And this helps us be more humanistic in how we respond. It helps us make sure that if this child that's bullying is bullying maladaptively, meaning there's something wrong in their life, we are not compounding what is wrong in their life by treating them as a bad person. So that's going to help us. So let's talk about Operant Conditioning 101. If you took any psychology in college, you probably heard about operant conditioning, and that's what we're going to talk about. Operant conditioning, this is B.F. Skinner's work, on how behaviors are learned and unlearned, and we're specifically going to talk about how we cause unlearning or the extinction of behavior. Now, remember what I said, this is established science. If you type in operant conditioning, extinguishing a behavior, you're going to get into Google Scholar, you are going to get hundreds of thousands of scholarly documents on behavioral extinction from operant conditioning that all say the same thing. Right? There are no counterexamples to what I am about to teach you. This is established science. Operant conditioning 101 is that there's a stimulus and response, right? So there is some sort of stimulus. The traditional thing is getting a dog to salivate at the sound of a bell. So the stimulus is the bell. How that stimulus is responded to is going to shape the behavior. So if you ring a bell and you give the animal something they like, they start associating the ringing of a bell with whatever the reward is. Now, this is what we call classical conditioning, meaning that it's not in operant control. It's not in control of the animal. So it's an instinctual response to whatever the stimulus is. So salivating at the sound of a bell is an instinctual response. It's not something a dog is going to choose to do. It's something that they have been classically conditioned to do. Operant conditioning is a little bit different. Operant conditioning is when the animal has a choice about the behavior. They are an operator. So this is a picture of me training a dolphin in Hawaii. And this is where I learned all of these skills. For me, I learned it as book knowledge, but I also learned it as an apprenticed skill. Now, operant conditioning is when you ask the animal to do something, and then if they do it, you reward them in some way, shape, or form. So think about training a dog to sit at the command, sit. They have a choice to sit or not to sit. And if they do sit, you can reward them. If they don't sit, then you do other things to try and get the behavior you want. But this is a conditioned response, operant conditioned response, meaning the operator has a choice of behavior at all times. So they can choose they can do it pretty reliably. They can choose, this time I'm not going to do it. It's something that they are, as an operator, in control of. Classical conditioning is instinctual responses to stimulus. Operant conditioning is chosen responses to stimulus. Now, this is really powerful because when we think about a bullying dynamic, we're thinking about there's a kid doing something and another kid responding to what that kid is doing. The first kid who's responding to the bully has a choice in how they're going to respond. And then the bully has a choice in how they're going to respond, most times, to what the kid they targeted does. And it's like a dance. But in most cases, the responses can be chosen, and that gives us a lot of power over how we respond, because the child responding to a bully and an adult responding to a bully, they can choose their response and therefore impact the next behavior of the bully. And that's a lot of power. So in order to control this dynamic, because it's operant conditioned and not instinctual, classically conditioned, we can actually choose our responses and choose how we can condition the other person. This is a lot of power. And there's a reason why humanistic psychologists, and yeah, I'm a humanist, and I'm going to share a link in my course on why, as a humanist, I'm teaching behavioralism, because there's really no conflict anymore. But it is kind of scary to think that you can condition people to behave certain ways towards you, but there's a lot of power to it. Now, the reason I think it's ethical to teach these things is we are being conditioned by people all the time. The people around us are conditioning us all the time. We are conditioning people all the time. The only way to not be conditioned by your conditions, to quote Viktor Frankl, is to understand how this happens. Consider this defensive knowledge. It should not be used offensively, but it is defensive. So this dynamic plays out, this bullying dynamic plays out in abusive relationships, all sorts of things. Once you understand this dynamic, you can start controlling it by controlling your own response to it. We are not waiting for the other person to change. We are going to change what we are doing, and by doing that, we are going to change what the other person does. But it starts with us and our choices and our behavior. So let's talk about reinforcements and responses in a behavioral conditioned and an operant conditioned framework. And again, you can look up operant conditioning and see all the research. There's 70 plus years of research on this. All right, so the first reinforcement and response is positive, meaning whatever happened you like. Whatever just happened is good for you. And it's easy to see how this would positively reinforce a behavior. If you have ice cream and you like ice cream and you eat ice cream and you have a positive response from eating ice cream, you're gonna want more ice cream, right? So positive reinforcement is reinforcement. Now, when we're talking about bullying behavior, unwanted behavior of any sort, we don't want to positively reinforce it. We don't want to give a response to the bully that they are going to like and consider positive, because that will make them want to do it more. And this is actually how most bullying occurs. Kids learn that being aggressive works to get their way. That if they're aggressive with their peers, they can get the kids to play the game they want to play. And so they learn being aggressive works. This is how most bullying starts. It's not because the parents are bad. It's not because the kid is bad. It's that they learned this works through positive reinforcement. All right. So we don't want to positively reinforce a bully. The second possible response is negative. We don't like what happened, and we don't want it to happen again. This actually so let me give you an example of it, and then we'll talk about how it applies to bullying. Imagine, and this is a personal experience, I don't like hot dogs. I have a classically conditioned response to the smell of hot dogs, meaning if I smell a hot dog, I get physically nauseous and want to throw up. And this happened because the very first time I ever had a hot dog, I got violently ill and threw up. And so now every time I smell a hot dog, I'm classically conditioned, I have a physical response to it. And this is classically conditioned. I'm not in control of my response. I can't choose to not be nauseous at the smell of a hot dog. I'm classically conditioned by it. But in the instance of a bully, what we need to understand is that this negative reinforcement, this negative response is still reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is still reinforcement. All right. And the way this works, so this negative experience only works really the first couple of times they experience something. If they have been positively reinforced for something, and then they get a negative reinforcement for it, they're going to view that negative reinforcement as a strengthener. It's going to strengthen the behavior you don't want. And there's a whole bunch of science on why this happens. It happens, right? So in the context of bullying, maybe this bully has always gotten their way by being aggressive, and then someone stands up to them. They don't view that as, oh, it doesn't work, right? They view it as, there's a problem with this person because they're not behaving the way I expect them to, so I'm going to do it more. Right? So negative, and they're going to feel justified in doing it more because this other person deserves it more by not complying with them. The other person is the problem. That's how bullies respond to negative reinforcement. Right? It doesn't stop the behavior, it reinforces it and makes it worse. So we don't want to positively reinforce the bully. We also don't want to negatively reinforce them because both of those are reinforcement. So what do we need to do? And the answer is the third option, which is no response or neutral response. The literature, again, we have 70 plus years of people researching how to extinguish unwanted behavior through operant conditioning. And the answer is that you provide a neutral response. Neutral response does not reward the behavior. It does not reinforce the behavior. It's just not what the bully wanted. So there's positive, there's negative, and neutral. And when you think about the advice that's given to kids who are being bullied, most of it is ignore them and they'll go away. What that statement is trying to get to is actually don't reward them and they will eventually go away. Not rewarding someone is not the same as punishing them. Right? Punishment is negative reinforcement. It's going to reinforce the behavior by the time you get them in the classroom. By the time you get them, they've already learned this works. So negative is not going to work. Punishment's not going to work. Neutral response will. So what does this look like? Well, if you've got kids calling each other, and we're going to go through specific examples of this later in the program, but if you've got kids calling other kids names, you can tell one kid that the way to stand up to them and get them to stop is to tell them what they're doing is not okay. Calmly. And one of the techniques is like, I don't know if you've heard of this, the gray rock technique, where you imagine you are a gray rock responding. You eliminate all your emotional response. And you say something like, that's not a nice thing to say. And this is not a plea for them to stop. It's a statement of fact. That's not a nice thing to say. I taught my son to say, thank you for that information. It's very helpful. When someone told him he was ugly or whatever the thing was, just thank you for that information. It's very helpful. And then to stare at them. The key to doing this is to not have emotion, which is hard to do when a bully's in your face, kind of saying mean things to you. But this is the technique that's going to work and what you should be helping kids learn. It's an emotionally neutral response that tells the other kid, issues what we call a delta, a signal that what they just did was not okay and they're not going to get the reward. So when we work with dolphins, if they did something wrong, doing something wrong was not a cause for punishment. It was just a notice. That wasn't okay. We slapped the side of the tank and made a loud noise. You're hearing me do this. We often use no as a delta. So this is a signal to the kid that what they did was not okay and it's time to reset and try again. And they have another opportunity to do it right and receive a positive response. That's all that is needed, and we should be teaching kids how to reset these things. That's not how we treat people in this classroom. Just stare at them, neutral, whatever. This is going back to why we needed compassion. Compassion helps us put us in the mind where we can do this. If you are upset and angry, you're going to positively reinforce the bully because they're getting what they want. They want you to be upset. Neutral response means they didn't get to you. Whatever they just tried to do did not work, and you are standing up to them and telling them that's not how we treat people here. And that's a statement of fact. It's not a request. And this neutral kind of staring at them means also that the child that they just challenged is not backing down. Now, if you have a kid with a special needs, with autism, or some issue that makes looking at someone's face really uncomfortable, most kids can do this. They can just stare at the other kid and wait for the other kid to disengage and back off. And that's actually what you want them to do. You want to be calm and collected and basically say that's not okay. And the other kid's going to respond like, ah, and then that's not okay. And when the bully kid disengages, that means that the kid who did this just won that interaction, right? The other kid didn't get what they want and they disengaged and went away. Now, for kids that have trouble making eye contact, they're not going to be able to stare at this other kid. So some things that you can teach them to do is maybe look at the top of the head, maybe look at their ear, focus on the ear. Whatever they do in Western society, looking down is viewed as submission. So if I'm looking down and saying that's not very nice, I am submitting to this bully. That's not what we want them to do, because that means the bully's going to take that as a win. It's important that we make eye contact and that we look at them and say that's not how we treat people here. And just stare at them. And that's what you should be teaching kids. That's one part of what you should be teaching kids to do. If they say someone's calling me names, they say, okay, I need you to this is how I want you to respond to this in the future. This is what I want you to say, and this is how I want you to say it. And if you can't make eye contact, look at their ear, but do this. And you have a standard response in your classroom that you want kids to say in the case of someone being mean to them. And if the kid continues to be mean to them, you want to know about it. Right? You don't want to necessarily know about it right away because you want the kids to learn how to handle these situations on their own, right? But if the problem doesn't go away or escalates, that you need to know that. But you need to give the kids the skills and the knowledge of what standing up to a bully looks like. Telling them to ignore it and it'll go away doesn't actually work. And you're not telling them the right thing. You're telling them, look, I need you to respond to them neutrally, not emotionally. So think about them with compassion. I know they just said something mean, but that's their problem because they're not behaving right. So we're going to help them behave better and be nicer. But to do that, I need you to remind them that that's not how we treat people in this classroom. and if they continue, let me know. If this stops them, say it it doesn't matter what they say. Do not argue with them. Just keep saying that's not how we treat people in this classroom, and say it out loud and try to make eye contact. If you can't, look at their ear or the top of their head. And if it continues or it escalates, you come get me. Okay? This is going to so powerfully transform what's happening in your classroom you can't even imagine. All right, and it'll help shut this down because it's going to create a cultural norm where the kids know how to stop it and know how to report it. And so that's what you want them to do, is this neutral response. And you need to tell them, when you do this, this person might not disengage right away. And that's fine. They might escalate for a little bit. That's fine. Just keep repeating this. And if it keeps going, then you get me. All right? This is what we want to teach kids, how to handle this themselves. But if they can't handle it themselves because the other kid's really behaving badly, that's when you want to know about it. So the second part of operant conditioning, we now talked about positive, negative, and neutral responses. The second part has to do with reinforcement schedules and how they impact behavioral extinction. There's two possible ways we can respond and provide reinforcements to a behavior in operant conditioning protocols. The first is consistent, meaning every time something happens, we respond consistently. This is why having something you ask the kids to say to one another that is polite, that is a statement of fact, that's not how we treat people in this classroom, that they don't argue. It shuts down all arguments. The impulse is for the targeted kid to argue and say, no, I'm not stinky, or no, I'm not whatever. They don't need to argue. Arguing positively reinforces the bully. Whatever this statement is, that's not how we treat people in this classroom. We treat people in this classroom with dignity. That's a statement of fact that can be repeated over and over regardless of the situation. This consistent response is going to weaken the unwanted behavior. And again, we have 70 plus years of research that shows us the impact of consistent reinforcement. It weakens the behavior, which is what we want. The other possibility is that we respond variably. And that means that sometimes we say our go-to phrase, sometimes we cry and run away, sometimes we just stare at them, right? The response is variable. Now, the problem with a variable reinforcement is that it strengthens the unwanted behavior. This is one of those counterintuitive things, and unfortunately, with abusive behavior, this is what we tend to fall into. We will tell kids to ignore it, and it'll go away. And then the bully gets worse and strengthens, and so the child starts responding again, and the child's trying a bunch of different things to try and make it stop, and that's actually making the behavior stronger and worse, and we don't want that. There is a whole lot of science about why when you do variable reinforcement, you're actually strengthening the behavior, but it boils down to this. When you remove the reward, you start the behavioral extinction process. It's a process that takes place over time, and in order to get the behavior to stop, you have to complete that process. Now, most of what is taught in anti-bullying courses has to do with how to start this process, but they don't spend a lot of time on how to complete it. It's not that the information is bad, it's more that it's incomplete. But this variable reinforcement, our tendency to be variable, is key to getting it to stop. In order for the removal of reward to work, it has to be done consistently. Because what's going to happen is a bully is going to try and get the reward back. If they lose a reward, they're going to try and get the reward back. And if you give them the reward back, you've just rewarded them for their increased aggression. And that's the simple way to describe what variable reinforcement does in a bullying situation. So it's very important that we teach the kids that we want them to be consistent. That variable, we don't want them to vary their response. They need to be 100% consistent in what they say to a bully and how they respond, and that we need them to be neutral, and that if they don't feel it's working, that they should come to you instead of changing what they're doing. That's when you should get involved. And that's, we're going to go more into the specifics of that in a little bit, but consistent helps get rid of the behavior. Variable reinforcement is going to strengthen it. And this is also the reason why bullying tends to spike in middle school. Like, that's when it's at its worst, is in middle school. It's not just the hormones, although that's part of that. Part of it is that kids have been trying to get it to stop and failing, and trying to get it to stop and failing for a very long time, and all of that failed attempts is actually making the behavior worse rather than getting it to go away. And eventually what kids figure out is they stop caring. They find their tribe of kids, if they're lucky, and then they don't care what the bullies are doing. And that's when they start consistently reinforcing and the way they should, and that's when it starts to tail off. And that's exactly what we would expect to see. What we're seeing in the data is exactly what we would expect to see based on the behavior, what we know of behavioral conditioning and operant conditioning, and these positive, negative, neutrals, and consistent versus variable reinforcement schedules. And we're going to talk about the teacher's role. Right now I'm mostly talking about, what you need to know, what's going to work to make it stop, and the kid's role in this. Your role as the teacher is to help teach these skills, but you also have an additional role, which is to increase the cost. Increasing the cost does not mean punishing. It just means putting the kid on notice, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So let's talk about reinforcing to our advantage. What we want is consistent, neutral responses. And that is what is going to work to weaken the behavior and get it to extinguish. If we do this, what we're going to see is that the bullying child is going to try and get the reward back. And if we consistently remove that reward and keep them from getting that reward, they will eventually stop. That's the ideal. What normally happens is that we tell the kid what to do, the kid does it, and then it doesn't work because it makes the bullying worse, and so they try something else. And that's the definition of variable, and that's what makes it worse. So it's really important as teachers, we explain to kids when we tell them how we want to respond that this is not a one-time thing, that we need them to do this consistently, and we need to teach them what to expect from the bully in return. That they can't just say this and be done with it. They can't just report it to you and have it be over. That's not how behavioral extinction works. You need to do this response consistently, and they need to not expect this to work right away, but that you're going to work with them and help them to make this stop over time, and that you've got their back. And that if they're having trouble, don't change what they're doing, come to you for additional help. Okay? Because if they don't do that, they're going to fall into variable, and variable is going to make it worse. And it's also going to be invisible to you, because they will stop coming to you, because they will stop trusting that you can help them. What we do is we tell them how to respond, they try it, it escalates, because that's what's predicted to occur in the data, and I'm going to tell you why in the next session, in the next slide. And then the kid thinks this doesn't work, there's no point in reporting, it just gets worse. And then it becomes invisible to you. You think the problem is solved, but it's not actually solved, it's now just hidden. So we need to start teaching the kids that this is a process over time, and that you need them to be consistent, and if they feel it's not working, they should come to you for additional help. That is okay, this is part of the process, you expect it to not work right away, and that if it's getting worse, that you need to know about that, and they should be telling you about it. Is this kind of a hassle at the get-go? Yeah, I mean, you have teaching to teach, and it's having kids interrupt you by saying Joe is being mean or whatever it is, that disrupts the lesson. But you either put the energy into helping the kids sort out these interpersonal relationships at the get-go, or they're being distracted by this anyways, and you're just not knowing that they are. So this does have to be taken into account. If you can get this under control early on in the classroom, then the rest of the year should go fairly well. And that's doubly true of for the younger grades. The younger you can start this, the better it is for all the teachers who come after you. Let's talk about blowouts and why variable reinforcement is so problematic. So, behavioral conditioning 101. When you remove a reward for behavior, not punishing it, removing the reward, it's going to escalate the behavior. And so we have this graph here. It's a lovely little graph. You have some sort of constant behavior that's happening, and then you remove the reward, and the behavior escalates. This is predicted to occur. This escalation of behavior is predicted to occur. It means that the removal of reward is working. If they get their reward back during escalation, you now have created a new normal. So what a bully has learned is I've got some level of aggression that's going on and it's working. It stops working. So the bully does what they were doing more and they escalate more. And if they get their reward at this higher level, that's the new normal. What they have learned is I just need to be extra aggressive to get what I want. You don't want them to learn that. You want them to learn that no matter how aggressive they get, they're not getting their reward. And it's only after they've escalated, and how bad that gets, it could be really bad depending on the child. In most cases, this is going to resolve in a week. In some cases, it's not going to resolve, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. When it does that, we call it a blowout. It's only after the blowout that the behavior's extinguished. And I'm going to put extinguished in air quotes because humans are free-range animals. They can always get this reward from another child or another person in their neighborhood. You can't truly extinguish unwanted behavior, but you can get it to stop in certain situations, and that's what you're looking for in your classroom. So let me give you an example with an animal, and then again we'll look at this from a child's perspective. Let's say you have a rat that's used in a cage that's used to pressing a lever to get its food, and one day it presses the lever and doesn't get its food. What is that rat going to do? Well, it's going to press that lever more in an attempt to get its food until it's pressing it almost all the time, and then only then, if it continues to not get its reward, will it give up. And that's the behavioral extinction. With kids, it works the same way. They stop getting their reward from bullying, they escalate their behavior, and if it continues to not be rewarded, they will eventually stop. That's what we need to let kids know, that they should expect some escalation before it stops. They should expect to get pushback on this. That's fine. It means what they're doing is working. If it gets really bad, or if it's already violent, then this is going to be a problem. Because if the bullying is where a kid's already being punched and they stop rewarding that, they're going to get punched more. So it's very important that you understand what the manifestation of this behavior is before you start this process. And kids won't necessarily be honest with you about how bad it is. Sometimes it's really, really bad. But it's very important because wherever they are now, they lose that reward and they're going to escalate before they get better. So that's why the consistent is really important, because if you're not consistent, then the bully learns that I just need to be worse to get my reward. How long does this take, and how bad can it get? That depends on the kid and what's going on with them. And it also depends on how long it's been going on. So if it's been going on a really long time, this process is going to take a longer time. If it's brand new, you can stop it in its tracks almost immediately. So the first time someone says to a kid, "Hey, you're stupid," and they say, "That's not how you treat people in class," and stare at them, the other kids go, "Oh, all right," and they're going to back down. Which is why it's easier to prevent than to extinguish. If it's been going on for a really long time, if this kid has been targeted for a year or two, then this is going to take a while and it can get really bad. How long does this take? It depends on how long this behavior has been going on and how long the behavior has been reinforced. The longer it's been going on, the more it's being reinforced, the longer it's going to take, and the harder it's going to be to get it to stop. This is why almost all bullying programs are aimed at prevention. We want to prevent this because it's easier to prevent than to extinguish. Once you have an established behavior that's been going on for a while, it's not just a simple matter of not rewarding it and it goes away. It's now not rewarded, it escalates, and then it escalates some more, and it could escalate quite a bit. And then if you're lucky, it goes away. Extinguishing an unwanted behavior is literally the hardest of the behavioral conditioning, the operant conditioning techniques to get right because of this escalation that we saw in the previous slide. So we want to prevent this rather than extinguish it, which is why if you're an elementary grade teacher, this is so important. Because this is when the kids are first coming into the classrooms and learning how to interact and how to be with one another. It's easier to prevent than extinguish. If it is chronic, it's going to take a while. It could be 2 or 3 weeks, possibly longer, depending on what's going on, and also what's causing this kid to bully. Are they bullying adaptively, meaning they're doing it strategically? This could be over very quickly. If the kid is bullying maladaptively, they probably won't stop until whatever the underlying problem is that they have is solved, because they're acting out to get attention and to get noticed and to get help, and they don't know how to, they're kids, they don't know how to ask for help. Most kids don't know how to ask, so they behave badly. If there's something really wrong, and it could never be fixed, right? If someone's psychopath, that's not something that you have the background to fix. So our goal should be to help the adaptive bullying stop so that we can identify the maladaptive bullying and the kids that need additional help. Not very few bullies actually need real big interventions, but those that do need intervention to get help. And again, this is why the compassion mindset is so important. But we do need to tell the kids to be prepared for that. Let's talk about some real life examples. How does this play out? And talk about the teacher's role in this. Name calling. This is verbal bullying. Whether it's done cyberbullying, whether it's in person, it's the same thing. It's a verbal attack on someone. This can be handled, actually, if it's verbal, it can be handled verbally. That's not how we treat people. And then if it keeps happening, the child should raise their hand and tell the teacher, so-and-so called me a name, right? That's all that the child needs to do. Try and get it to stop by using a neutral response, a reminder, a delta. This is not how we treat people in the classroom. And if it continues, teacher, they called me names. What your response to that should be is an immediate response. Verify it happened, that the person's not falsely accusing. Did you hear this? The other kids, did this really happen? Yes? Okay, fine. And then you take a consequence. This consequence is not to punish the child that called people's names. It's to give them corrective training on how to behave better. That's not how we treat people in our class. Did they do something that upset you? What is going on with your life that this is not normally like you? I expect more from you. All the things, the interventions, the positive, how do we help kids behave better interventions. Don't jump to they're a horrible kid right away. Help them learn how to behave better. If they're trying to get, it's entirely possible that they're victims of bullying themselves, right? If someone acts out, it's not unusual that they are acting out in response to being bullied. And then the bully just said, oh, Miss So-and-so, this kid just called me a name, and you're not getting the whole story. So if they say, well, so-and-so was bullying me and I was just fighting back, say, okay, fine. I believe you. Here's how I want you to respond to that in the future. If they're calling you names, you tell them. That's not how we treat people. And if they continue, you raise your hand and tell me so that I can take care of it. You as the child don't need to take care of it. You've done your job if you've told them to stop. If they don't stop, now it's on them. But you don't act out inappropriately to get them to stop, because that's not going to work. All it's going to do is make me think that you're the problem. So if you're not the problem, do what I need you to do, and we'll move from there. And this will sort itself out. The kids that are bullying may try to use this to get other kids in trouble, But kids like to tell on other kids, so it'll sort itself out. Just remind them what the protocol is for someone who's being mean to them. That's not how we treat people, and if they continue, report them. And then you step in and take whatever corrective action is needed. So, if the bullying has risen to the level of a threat of violence, and this does happen in the schools, then the response is, if you do that, I will report you. And if the child does it, report them. Then they are to report. You can decide as a teacher that this is, a zero strike issue. If someone threatens violence against someone else, they are to immediately report it to you. That they don't have to say, stop, this is not how we treat people. They can just report that to you. It's up to you how you want to handle that. Often threats of violence, especially with little kids, they don't really have the ability to carry out a threat. So you can tell them that's not how we treat people, and if you do that, I will report you. And if the kid continues, then they get reported, right? So it's similar because we're talking about often a verbal threat, that it can be treated verbally, but you do have to be aware that if it's risen to levels of threat, that this isn't simply name calling, that someone is threatening someone else, that we're already in stage 2 of escalation, right? That an escalation of this behavior is going to be more threats or violence. And that's not an if. You are now in a how bad is it going to be situation. This does not mean that the kid necessarily has the ability to carry out the threat, but you should consider the possibility that they will. And take corrective actions to help protect the threatened individual. This means not isolating the threatened individual to keep them safe. It means isolating the person who made the threat. And again, you're doing this to help them, because if some kid is making a threat, something's wrong. This is not normal child behavior, right? So you should be entering into this, how can I help this child if possible? And that means isolating. If someone's threatened someone else, they don't get to sit at the table with everyone else. They have to be isolated and be socially excluded. You don't let a threat of violence isolate a threatened kid, because that's actually a win. Bullying is often about social inclusion and exclusion. And so what the bully is trying to do is create an in-group and an out-group, and they're labeling some kids as out in order to be perceived as the person who has the power to decide who's in and who's out. And you don't want to do that work for them by isolating a kid who's been threatened. You want to isolate the people making the threat so that they don't have the ability to carry it out. If the threat is physical, like kids walking down the hall and they were shoved or something like that, that actually is now a physically aggressive act and not a threat of violence. It's actually violent. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. But you can sort of handle this as a verbal bullying situation. Just be aware that escalation could be actual violence. So when you talk to the child who's been targeted, you can ask them, how do you want me to handle this? How do you want to be protected by this? Here's what I need you to do. If they threaten you, this is what I need you to say. But I need to know right away that you were threatened so that I can intervene and protect you. But if we're talking about something that's happening in the hallway, what do we need to do to help you? Do we need to give you a buddy that will watch out for you to make you less vulnerable? Because there's kids in the classroom that are willing to act as the buddy for these things, and you can help the isolated kid be less isolated, and that helps prevent the bully from being able to isolate them, if that makes sense. Actual violence. An escalation, if bullying has risen to the level of actual violence, then an escalation of actual violence is more violence. So it's not something that you can now tell the kid, hey, just tell them this, right? No, because if they do that, they're going to get hit. If they're already being hit and they say, hey, we don't treat people like that, they're going to get hit again. And that's not what you want. At this point, you need administrators and teachers need to take interventive action to isolate the violent kids so that they do not have the ability to hurt other kids. Do not think that this is a conflict, that this is in any way justified, that this can be moderated. It's very important for you to know exactly what form bullying is taking, whether it's verbal or whether it's threats of violence or whether it's actual violence. Because if we're in threats of violence or actual violence phase, then the escalation could be violence, and your first priority is to protect kids from being physically hurt. So, take corrective action. What I recommend, and I have it in my downloadable documents at my website, is a documentation log. Bullying is a pattern of behavior. It's not a one-off incident. Verbal unniceties can be handled this way, but if it's a pattern of behavior, bullying is a pattern of behavior, harassment is a pattern of behavior. To show that, you need the documentation log. And you have to ask kids, okay, write down what's happening. Keep a log of all these incidences for me so that I can see this pattern and address the pattern of behavior and help protect you. And if the bully says, well, I'm the one who's being bullied and I'm just responding to that, say, fine. This is what I need you to do, and treat them as a victim and tell them this is how I want you to handle it in the future. If a kid is being bullied, they will do this process because they want it to stop and they want your help. Someone who is a bully is going to not follow this process, right? But you need to be aware if what is being alleged is actual violence, then the escalation will be more violence and worse violence. So you don't take this and say, well, you know, do this, and if they get violent, tell me. No, you need to take corrective action to protect kids from violence and make sure it doesn't happen again. And that's a completely different set of protocols. And that can be very difficult in a school environment. You know, my son one time, I think when he was in 3rd grade, there was a kindergartner punching kids in the stomach on the bus as they walked onto the bus. And he thought it was funny. But this kid, by the time my son was punched, was the 8th kid, according to the bus driver. My kid was like the 8th kid who got hit and in the stomach. And the parent hadn't even been notified because the bus driver was putting in these reports and giving them to their supervisor. And their supervisor hadn't forwarded them over to the principal yet. So the principal didn't even know this was happening. And this kid was 2 incidences away from being banned from the bus for the whole year. And this was like the first, second month of school. And the parent hadn't been notified, the school hadn't been notified. So what I want you to understand is that the child needs to be put on notice. Even if you're not going to take corrective action right now, they need to know that they didn't get away with it, that it was notified, that you were notified, that this has been reported, and that there will be corrective action. Now again, if you're at the stage of actual violence, this has been going on for a while, you need to expect the escalation and prepare for that by protecting kids and putting them in situations where they can't do this. That the victimized kids needs friends that will walk with them to and from. They need an escort. But it's actually better to make sure that the kid accused of doing this has an escort, a teacher escort, that they are not allowed outside of adult supervision until this is resolved. Because if you've got a kid accused of hitting another kid or shoving them into a locker or slamming a locker on someone's fingers, you've got a physically aggressive kid that has to be monitored. Is that extra work? Of course it's extra work. But your option is to either monitor them or risk them hurting someone else. Because once they are reported, they are going to escalate because they're already escalating. They're no longer this isn't just calling someone a name or saying, I don't want to play with you on the playground. If they're physically hurting someone, they're engaging in battery, which in the adult world is a crime. Treat it accordingly. We don't want these kids to go to jail. We want them to learn how to behave better. But part of that is not giving them the opportunity to misbehave, and that requires monitoring them. So coming up with a system where they are maybe walked from class to class by a monitor, something like that would work really well because it would eliminate those opportunities for them to behave badly. And if they don't have those opportunities, they can't get positively rewarded for it, and eventually it'll stop. And again, the goal is to reform them, not to harm them. Complex interactions. As I mentioned before, sometimes the victim is looking like they're the bully. That sometimes, they're responding to what's happening to them by acting out. So at the beginning of a reporting of bullying, it's really hard to know what's going on and why it's going on. And I hope you have realized through this, I haven't really talked about why. It really doesn't matter why a kid is behaving poorly, only that they are behaving poorly. Now, for the victim of this, it's not their job to diagnose the mental health of one of their peers. It's just not. What you need from the victims is for them to respond in a way that does not reward the bully and that notifies you of what's going on and all that's going on. And it could be, I had a kid go through my online bullying toolkit, and once they started reporting, they reported 30, 40 instances a day of little things that were going on that in total were really, really bad. So these documentation logs can help you get track of what exactly is going on. It might seem like a lot of work, and it is, but it's going to help you see what's happening more clearly if you can do this. And you also need the kids to keep reporting. So here's what kind of happens when we ask kids to report. They report, and then we get annoyed that they reported, because now we can't teach, we have to deal with whatever this interpersonal issue is. And then what we're teaching the kids is that they shouldn't report because we're annoyed with them when they report, even though we told them we want them to report. Right? Don't do that to kids. If you tell kids to report to you bad things that are happening in the school, and to them, thank them when they report it. It could be a lot of stuff. It could be a lot of stuff. It could be 30, 40, 50 things a day that are happening. This girl that I told you about that took my course, she reported getting death threats. When she finally started filling out the documentation on it, was 30, 40 things a day, including death threats. So don't treat kids reporting as a hassle. Positively reward them and say, thank you for doing this. I'm going to take a note of it. I'm going to start working on this. Here's what I need you to do in response to this. Keep letting me know. If it's too many things, say, keep a list and tell me at the end of the day, unless you're getting a threat. If you get a threat, I want it right away. But with these minor things that are happening, here's how I want you to respond, and I want you to make a note of it on your folder, on your log, and then tell me at the end of the day. But if you get a threat, here's how I want you to handle it, and tell me right away. If they hit you or do anything physical, immediately tell me. All right? And that way you're getting the log, but you're not necessarily being interrupted for, a kid being called stupid by their peers or whatever it is. You're helping them learn self-sufficiency for the minor things and teaching them that it's okay to ask for help for the big things. And there's ways and that's really important that you get that right, because if you don't, they will stop reporting to you, and then you won't know what's going on and you will be unable to help them. And thinking that nothing is going on when something really bad is going on is not helpful to anybody in the classroom. So again, sometimes the victim of bullying is acting as a bully. This happens. And so what you want to do is and this is another reason to treat everybody with compassion, is if someone is accused of bullying and they say that they are the victims, that's fine. Treat them with compassion and say, okay, here's how I want you to handle this in the future, and I will help you sort this out. And then when they come to you for help, continue helping them. Don't just say, well, I'm in the middle of a lesson now, can we do this later? Say, I understand. Here's what I want you to report on right away, threats of violence and physical violence. Everything else, I want you to respond this way. That's not how you treat people in this class, and I want you to document it. Write it down that when it happened and stuff like that. And that'll help you kind of not be overwhelmed, but also keep control of what's going on. The other thing you're going to want to teach kids how to do is how to defend someone else. So as soon as this kid learns how to shut this down on their own, like someone's telling them they're stupid and they've learned how to say this and they've gotten the kid to back off, the very next question they're going to ask is, well, this is happening to my friend Susie, or whoever it is. And you can tell them how to defend someone else and also report it. It's the same process. They say, that's not okay, that's not how we treat people in this classroom. They step into the situation. If it's physically violent, you don't want them to do that, right? But if it's verbal, they can step up and say, that's not how we treat people here. And then ask the victim if they can, to help them and to take them physically away from what's going on. The victimized kids doesn't need to stand there and take it. Someone can intervene and help them get to the teacher or to extra help. So if I was a student watching another kid get bullied, I could step up to the side of what's going on and say, this is not how we treat people in our school. And then I would turn to the bully and say, come with me, I'm going to help you. And I would remove them from the situation while making sure that they know they have a friend. I'm not negatively punishing this kid. I'm supporting them, but I'm also putting the bully on notice. And then the defending kid should be notifying a teacher of what's going on. Because often victims won't speak up for themselves. They're just going to take it and feel bad about it. So you need to know if that's the case, that someone's being victimized and they're not willing to stand up for themselves or not capable of it. It's not necessarily not willing. They might not be capable of it. And again, you don't know what's going on. So positively reinforcing kids who stand up for other kids is something you want to do. And you want to really think about your own responses to kids that come to you and tell you there's a problem going on, so that you can positively help them. And one of that is telling kids, this is how I want you to handle it. Here's how I want you to support the victim. And I want you to make sure they have friends so that they are less targeted. So, feel free to include them in your group so that they're not isolated by a target for a bully. And then also report so that you know what's going on. And again, you can set rules for how this happens. Ideally, we want kids to learn how to handle verbal interactions on their own without having to come to you, but that can require some support at the beginning. We want to know if someone's being threatened or if there's an actual situation of violence going on. But again, positively reinforce kids who stand up for other kids. I have a book on this. It's called The Bully Vaccine. I have a website where I have a ton of free material. It's called thebullyvaccine.com. And I am available. This course can be used for in-service training for teachers. It can be done online, and it also, you can also pay me to come out to your school, I guess, if you want me to do that. That's fine too. I'm open for all of that. But the book itself has the outline of the science in it to help you with this. And it's also very helpful, by the way, to encourage parents of kids who are being victimized to learn this same process. And again, everything on my website is free. And you can recommend, except for the book, I don't have the ability to give the book away free. But all the other material on the website is free, and you can refer parents to it to learn so that they can support at home what it is you're teaching the kids in the classroom. Make sense?